Good afternoon, perhaps good morning or even good evening where you are, and welcome to this edition of PON Live. Today, the program on negotiation is delighted to present this event in celebration of Professor Deepak Malhotra's debut novel, The Peacemaker's Code, in a conversation moderated by his colleague, Max Bazerman. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. The Program on Negotiation is a consortium of Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Tufts University. At PON, we work to help people solve problems, build successful relationships, and deal productively with conflict. And we are convinced that helping others learn to negotiate more effectively will assist them in their work, in their communities, and in their personal lives. And to that end, we're delighted to bring a series of virtual events to our global community. Today's participants come from all over the world, and I'm looking at my chat where folks are writing where they're coming in from, and thank you so much. We are honored that you've chosen to spend this hour with us. Of course, there will be a discussion, and then after that, there will be time for questions. To that end, please plan to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This allows all participants to upvote the questions that they think are the most relevant in case they have the same one. And if you have a comment, you can always write it, of course, in the chat. The talk will be recorded and it will be posted on the PON website in a couple of days. I'd like to thank the PON staff and especially Anna Chang and Diane Long for their help in organizing this program today. And now I'm happy to introduce today's speakers. Our two guests today have a lot in common. They are colleagues at Harvard Business School, co-authors of Negotiation Genius, and members of the Program on Negotiation's Executive Committee. Of course, we're here first and foremost to showcase the work of Deepak Malhotra, the Eli Goldstein Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Deepak is a celebrated professor, scholar, and advisor to CEOs and governments alike. And in addition to being a professor of business, he's an avid student of history. And those of you who have or will be reading the Peacemaker's Code are going to see that history really irrigates this work throughout the text. And finally, he's just added the title of novelist to his CV with the release last week of his debut work of fiction. Moderating the discussion with Deepak will be his colleague, co-author, and friend, Max Bazerman, the Jesse Isidore Strauss Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Max is likewise a renowned scholar, a distinguished educator, and a consultant. He is a prolific author, and we will be delighted to be having him back to PON Live, along with his co-author, Mike Luca, to discuss his latest of The Power of Experiments, and that will be a conversation taking place on April 23rd. And with that, I will be handing my virtual Zoom mic over to our two distinguished guests, Deepak and Max. Welcome to PON Live.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I also want to welcome Nicole to the Program on Negotiation. She's a fairly new managing director after Susan Hackley was in that position for a couple of decades. So Nicole, we're thrilled to have you with us and thank you for all you're doing so far. So it's a treat to be here. I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Program on Negotiation, in addition to being on the faculty at the Harvard Business School with Deepak. And one of the interesting parts of today's event is that I tend to think of the Program on Negotiation as a place that deals with nonfiction, or what we might think of as real stuff. And Deepak, you have a kind of an extensive history on negotiation, dealing with real things, from being an experimentalist who studies tightly controlled experiments on negotiation to writing a couple of books on negotiation. I think you're the only person who has produced a YouTube video on negotiation that has 1 million hits. Recently, you were named Professor of the Year by Poets and Quants, largely for your work in the world of negotiations. So the opening question I have for you is, why this book? What's with a book that's fiction? Where did the idea come from? And thinking about the audience, a lot of the audience consists of people who are focused on the real world of negotiations. So why should they read through hundreds of pages of stuff that isn't even real?
Yeah, well, great question, and I'll get to it in just a moment. I want to just add my thanks to the Program on Negotiation and to Nicole and Diane and James and Anna and the rest of the team, and to you, Max, for moderating this discussion and being here with us. And also, and especially thanks to the audience who's come in here. Everybody's busy. I know you all have a lot of things going on. And so Max's question is even more pertinent, which is not only why would you want to read a book like this, but why would you want to hear a discussion about a book that is, it's a sci-fi hook. It's a fiction novel. Why would you read that? And I think one of the hints, of course, is in the title, The Peacemaker's Code. The way this book came about, actually, it was a confluence of events. And last year, I launched a course at Harvard Business School called War and Peace, The Lessons of History for Strategy, Negotiation, Leadership, Humanity. It was just an entirely different set of things than I had been thinking about in the classroom, but it was not so different from what I do outside. In addition to working with organizations and businesses, I do a lot of pro bono advisory work with governments that are dealing with extreme conflict situations, crises, protracted conflicts, intractable conflicts. And so the course itself was a question mark. People might ask, why would you teach a course that is on war and peace and history in a business school? And the answer is because a lot of the lessons we can learn from these complex, complicated environments where things look like no-win situations, where it looks like everything that could have been tried has already been tried, where it looks like the shadow of the past is just so looming large, we can't solve these problems. What are the lessons we can extract from those for the kinds of negotiations that even people in the world of business might run into? What are the lessons for strategy? What are the lessons for difficult negotiations? What are the lessons for leadership? And so as I finished that course, my plan was to write a nonfiction book on a lot of those themes and on war and peace and the lessons we've learned from 2,500 years of human history. And right then is when COVID hit. And I had just finished the course, and then everything went into lockdown. And my plan was to wait a few weeks and then start this nonfiction book. And during that time, I had a conversation with someone in the Boston area who just in passing mentioned to me an idea for a book. It happened to be a fiction book. And my immediate response was, well, I'm not going to write a fiction book. That's not what I do. So I set it aside. But over the next month, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. And it just grew and grew and grew. And that kernel of an idea that my friend Zach had put in my mind turned into the premise for this book. And so at the end of April or May of last year, end of April, beginning of May, I started writing this book. Now, the reason I couldn't resist writing it was because the idea and the premise was, to me, so attractive. But also, I suddenly realized it would be another avenue through which I could discuss and think about these same ideas of negotiation, strategy, diplomacy, peacemaking. And maybe I'd be able to reach a different audience still from the ones we normally get to reach when we talk about negotiations at Harvard Business School or we write a nonfiction book. So my view is the more people we can touch with the ideas that we have as academics, the better. Hopefully these are valuable ideas. Hopefully these are practical ideas. But in this case, it was in some ways an additional channel for reaching a different audience who might not otherwise pick up a negotiation book or walk into one of our classrooms. And at the same time, it had to be entertaining. And so early on, I made the decision, and whether the audience likes it or not, I was not going to sacrifice entertainment value for educational value. This was the first time I was going to make sure that somebody who reads this book, who doesn't care a thing about negotiation or history or war or peace, would still love the journey. But I'm going to use this as an opportunity to also put in a lot of ideas and insights about those things. And my hope is that the balance has been a good one.
So who's the audience? Is it the negotiations crowd who wants to think more broadly, or is the audience really people who we don't typically think of as folks who would show up at the program on negotiation who we want to draw in? So is it sort of negotiation experts, or should we think of it as people who like the Watchmen series on Netflix? Yeah.
So if somebody came to me and said, I need a book on negotiation, and I've never read a book on negotiation, which one would you recommend? I would certainly not recommend The Peacemaker's Code as your intro to negotiation book. Or if somebody said, my number one concern is I'm dealing with really complex negotiations. Can I find a good book? I'd probably recommend a few other ones. But if you take somebody who says, I actually like the ideas of negotiation and conflict and history and all these things, and I'd love to sort of read something that puts them in a very different way and sort of comes at it in a way that's a little bit more deeper and insightful rather than the standard ways that we write nonfiction books. I think that person would enjoy it. But it's probably much more for people who are intrigued by that idea, but aren't going to spend hours upon hours reading a complete book unless they're going to be just enjoying every moment of it. So I think we can focus the attention of people that just want to learn about negotiations and are motivated to do that by reading, we co-authored a book, Negotiation Genius. You've written other books. I've written other books on negotiation. Our colleagues have written other books. Strangers have written other books. There's a lot of good books out there for somebody who just wants to learn negotiation. But somebody who's not willing to spend an entire book worth of time reading about negotiations, but is intrigued by those ideas or just wants a good time, I think the Peacemaker's Code is an interesting way to go about it.
Great. So I had the opportunity to read the sections of the book as you wrote them. So and I would say they arrived at a amazingly rapid clip. So I was kind of stunned by how fast you wrote this book. So can you give us some insight about how writing this book was different than your past writing?
So as Max mentioned, I had a handful of people that started reading this book even before I was completely sure how it would end, whether it would get published. Max and maybe about half a dozen, maybe 10 people total started reading it early. And then another 10 people read it right when it finished. And the feedback I got from these folks and the encouragement was extremely helpful. But what happened was I started writing this late at nights, and I would write from about 10 or 11 at night after the kids went to bed. And I would usually write till 3 or 4 in the morning, every night, night after night. And this is not something I normally do. I've never been this productive. I've never been this excited to get back to my laptop, to do any kind of work. And in 3 months, I think there was 1 week where I took a week off because I had to write a bunch of letters of recommendation, and I kind of had to make sure I got all those done. Other than that week, that's what I did. And once the early readers started to read, you can't write faster than somebody reads. So now there was a little bit of added pressure of getting the next section. But when I would go to write, the difference between writing nonfiction and fiction, at least for me, now that I've done a little bit of both, when I go to write a book like Negotiating the Impossible or Negotiation Genius with Max, when I sit down to write, I know what I'm going to write. I already know the ideas I'm trying to convey. There's no confusion about what do I want to convey to the audience. I might be thinking about what's the right word to use, but I already know which story I'm going to tell. I already know which principles I'm going to draw out. There's few surprises once you get to the computer. In writing this book, at least, and I'm not a seasoned fiction writer, so I can't say this is true for other fiction writers, I would tell my wife when she went to bed and I was going to the computer, I would say, you know what, I feel like I'm going to read a book I'm really into rather than write a book that I want to share with the audience, because I often had no idea what was going to happen next. I had some milestones, I had some broad themes. I sort of knew what the major conflict was going to be, or the conflicts, and but even the storylines emerged as I started writing. The negotiation elements of these, which would become relevant, were new. The characters emerged sometimes out of nowhere. And I would go to bed at night only because I felt like I really should, because I'm falling asleep now. But I would go to bed really excited about trying to figure out what would happen next, because we just got into a really interesting situation now. So it's not like nonfiction writing for me at all. It was just much more of a creative process rather than a pedagogical, educational process where I'm thinking about the audience from the point of view of how can I convey this idea best to my student or to my reader so that they can then run with it. This was more of a discovery, creative process. And I think the result of it is a much more entertaining read with educational elements throughout it.
So earlier, you talked about your new course, War and Peace, and you suggested that, like the Peacemaker's Code, teaching a course on War and Peace helped you identify broader themes that were relevant to students more broadly. Can you give us a couple of examples of ideas that come out of reading the book, The Peacemaker's Code?
Sure. And one of the things I want to make sure we don't do, and I will stick to this, I think, pretty cleanly, is not to give any spoilers. So if you're in the middle of reading this book or you're planning on reading this book, don't worry, I'm not going to say anything content-wise that would ruin what's going to happen. So I'm going to steer clear of all of that. But as examples of, even the title, The Peacemaker's Code, the word code has a couple of different definitions. One is, like symbols and characters that you use to hide a message. That's a code, and there's some relevance to that in the book. But code can also mean sort of principles, guiding principles that someone, an individual or a group of people use, like what's the code of the samurai. And that element is also relevant here because I think what the book sort of does is, in interesting ways, layered in at different levels, are what I would consider to be some principles and insights that should guide people that deal with really difficult negotiations. So one of the things that the main character in this book is fond of saying is every problem wants to be solved. That's almost like a mantra of this character. Every problem wants to be solved, and I think that's something that I think a lot of people that deal with really difficult situations and negotiations often keep in mind. If you approach a problem from the point of view of it's your enemy, if you're trying to sort of like defeat the problem, I think you actually do yourself a disservice. I think this attitude of every problem wants to be solved. It's giving you hints. It's giving you clues. There's a way out. You need to sort of work with it and figure out what it is. I think is a good mindset. It's something that I talk to my children about all the time. Whether they're dealing with a math problem or they're dealing with some other kind of issue, I always tell them every problem wants to be solved. And when you come to really difficult things like wars that have been going on for a long time, or conflicts that maybe they're not violent right now, but they're sort of deep-seated conflicts, one of the things that peacemakers are, I think, comfortable with in the idea of is that success is usually built on a lot of failures. So what you need is sort of the combination of confidence that although we have not been able to solve this yet, it can be solved. But with the humility of knowing that, you know what, the people that came before us are not morons. They're not idiots. They also tried their best. They're smart people. They were, in some cases, in many cases, well-intentioned. But being well-intentioned and smart, it turns out, is just not enough to solve the most difficult of negotiation problems. So in the War and Peace course, one of the things that I often talk to my students about is that if you're going to walk into a situation which other people have tried to solve and have not managed to do so, or they haven't made as much progress as they wish they had, and it could be a conflict, it could be a strategic issue, it could be a business problem. What you have to ask yourself is, what is my theory of the case? Why exactly do I think other people were unable to solve it? And if the only thing you can come up with is, well, they're not smart enough and I'm smarter, or their heart wasn't in the right place, but I really want to do this, you're probably not going to succeed. What you really need to think about is what was standing in the way of a deal or of resolving this issue. And the way, sort of a framework that I talk about in our course is, are the conditions different now than they were before? Because that could be an opportunity. Is the scope of the negotiation different now? Is the process you're going to take different? Or is the framing different? So these four elements can change over time and can be changed. So if none of these are different, then I'm at a bit of a loss as to why you think you're going to be able to succeed where everybody else failed. So conditions, have the conditions changed? What wasn't possible before might be possible now because these elements have changed. So let's strike while the iron is hot, or let's build the conditions that would help us succeed. Is the scope different? People are too narrowly focused on the negotiation. We need to broaden the scope. Or vice versa. Instead of having a broad scope, we want to narrow the scope. So can you change the scope of the negotiation in a way that makes it more possible? The third one being the process. The approach people took, the process that they laid out maybe was flawed. The sequencing was wrong. They didn't think through the elements that they needed to deal with first, and that's why they had problems, and you're going to take a different approach. Or is it the framing was all wrong? We walked into the negotiation. Every time we walked in, they thought of us as weak and desperate. That's why they were never willing to move. We've changed the frame because now they can see us as credible partners or strong partners, and that's going to change something. So what I always advise people to do is, what is your theory of the case? Why did they fail? And what are you going to do different? Is it going to be different conditions, scope, process, or frame? Because if the only thing you're counting on is, I'm just more persuasive, I sort of, I have a way with words, you're not going to solve the most difficult of problems. And then there's a lot of other things that we get into beyond that. But I won't belabor that point unless you want to ask a follow-up on it.
So I think I will. So first of all, as I listen to you talk about the book, and having been your colleague for many, many years now, I'm struck by the fact that I'm hearing you say things in answer to that question where it sounds a whole lot like Deepak Malhotra in the hallway over the last many years. And there's the main character in the book, a guy named Kilmer, who you might want to introduce to the audience, strikes me as having, let's say, at least a few similarities with you. Or to quote Anna Chang as we were talking before we went live, she said, "Are you Kilmer?" So can you tell us about Kilmer, his overlap with you, and what we're going to learn about Deepak Malhotra by following the journey of Kilmer?
So the answer to the last question is hopefully nothing, but I will address so anybody who's read the book and knows me will find some overlap. But here's who this guy is. So Professor Kilmer is actually a historian, and I am not a historian, although I love history. Professor Kilmer is a historian who gets sort of whisked off to Washington, D.C. to deal with sort of the ultimate conflict. And he happens to be, well-versed, very knowledgeable in the areas of history and war and peace and diplomacy. That's sort of his area of expertise. And he's not quite sure why he's being taken there. They don't give him very much information, but that's sort of the starting of the book. That's sort of what's happened. And the way Professor Kilmer has been described, which is not the way I would describe myself, incidentally, it was described this way both by somebody, a former student of mine who sent me an email just yesterday, said, "Oh my God, Kilmer is like a combination of X and Y." I happened to pick two of the same people that when Publishers Weekly's Book Life Reviews reviewed the book, described Professor Kilmer as a combination of Sherlock Holmes and Robert Langdon. And Robert Langdon is the protagonist in the Da Vinci Code, for those of you who are interested. Of course, Book Life's review also added Captain Picard as one of the sort of combinations of people. So Sherlock Holmes and Robert Langdon is not at all how I describe myself. But what I will say is that I needed the protagonist to be a character for whom I could think and speak. Because when this person is put into situations dealing with sort of no-win situations, extreme conflicts that seem to be completely unresolvable, when this person needs to navigate those, or when this person needs to sort of draw on knowledge of history and diplomacy, etc., if I wasn't equipped to help the character solve those problems or speak for them in those moments, the book wouldn't go very far. Because the book really is designed to create sort of like, for the people in the audience that might be nerdy sci-fi fans, and I don't mean nerdy in a bad way, I mean in a good way, might be familiar with this term like the Kobayashi Maru. It's a Star Trek term. It's sort of the no-win situation. How do you get out of that in a way that is strategic and holds true to the ideas of strategy, negotiation, diplomacy, and history, what we know about those, I think was what I needed to create. So when I think of this character, I see him as very different from me, the same way I see all the other characters in the book as very different from me. But because I had to build a character I could speak and think for, there's some similarities that people who know me will probably find the sort of overlap a little bit easily. And the last thing I'll say about this is that sometimes when people write like science fiction or fiction, or they write historical fiction, even the historical elements are fictionalized. I mean, that's what historical fiction is. It's sort of taking some historical event and making stuff up about it. What's, I think, interesting about this book is that although there's a completely fictional premise and the characters are fictional, the elements of history are all true. The information that you learn as you go along, you don't have to sit there wondering, like, is this one of those sort of, is this like the JFK movie where like I walk away with like 30% real things that happen and 70% that were just made up to make an interesting story? You'll know in this book what's fiction, which is the basic plot line, but the lessons that you're going to learn along the way, the nuggets you're going to pick up, things that happen in history, things that are sort of weaved into the story, all of those are actually real. And for that, the character needed to have somebody who wasn't just going to make stuff up. And I try not to make stuff up, other than the premise of the book.
So I'll ask you about one other character before we kind of move more broadly. But I think the number two character in the book is Kilmer's romantic interest, who's also a brilliant employee of an intelligence agency. Can you tell us a little bit about her and whether there were sort of negotiation lessons intended by how you developed her character?
Yeah. So one thing about her character is when I put her in the book, and even when I gave her a name, I didn't expect her to even be a major character. This character, I wasn't looking to write like a romance novel or something. I wasn't looking to have some relational element of that kind in the book. I mean, I had sort of this basic idea, this premise, and this sort of how the story was going to unfold. But a lot of the characters, including sort of, in a sense, the second most important character in the book, just showed up. And so she had existed in the plot line as an incidental character. And I was as surprised as maybe the reader would be to find out that she's no longer incidental. So it just happened one moment. So I wasn't thinking about who this person was when I put her in the book. But then in terms of her traits and characteristics, I think one of the things that happens is the characters you may like and dislike in this book, and the characters that are arguing with one another with different perspectives, I think what I've tried to do, I believe fairly, is that at least in my experience, and this is not just about the main two characters, when people are arguing and they're reasonably smart people arguing, nobody is completely wrong. Everybody has some basis, some logic by which they are coming to their conclusions. And so what you find in all these characters are some traits that you might like and some things that you might not like. But I think they come across, I would hope, as real people who have an understandable point of view, even when they're completely disagreeing with another character you happen to like just as well. And I think part of that dynamic exists in a few different bilateral relationships, but it's got a sort of a unique element when it comes to the dialogue that happens between the main character and the second character that you just mentioned, Max, because that allows for certain dialogues to take place that help us understand who these people are and what they're dealing with. So it's sort of a useful narrative tool. But as some people have noted, in addition to there being mystery and suspense and thrills and sci-fi and history and war and peace, there's also this theme of sort of a romantic element, which again, if somebody said you should write something with romance in it, I would have said, well, no, I think you've got the wrong guy. But it just happens so naturally in this book that you have these two characters that play off of each other, and together they end up sort of really propelling the story and the plot line as well in really, I think, interesting ways.
Okay, so now I'm going to go back a year ago. So before you sent me the first chunk of this book to read, you had recently completed this course, War and Peace, and I thought that the next thing I was going to see from you might be chapters from the book War and Peace. And I think that was your plan. Are you going to return to writing War and Peace? And if so, will having written the Peacemaker's Code help you write the book War and Peace?
Yeah, so it is now, again, the next book I'm going to write is the War and Peace nonfiction book. Now, it won't have the title War and Peace because that title apparently is taken, but it will be on those concepts. It'll be on the lessons of the book. Of the course and other lessons that I've learned through just advisory work and dealing with governments that are dealing with these issues. To the point about whether writing this book will make a difference, I think there's going to be one huge impact of having written something of fiction. And I think the students that have been in our classes, those of you who are online right now, I hope you sort of see that when we try to teach, we try to keep your perspective in mind first and foremost, right? We're trying to figure out how would we get someone to learn these. We're not just we're not trying to just talk to ourselves or proving things on a board. We're trying to educate with the student's perspective in mind. But what I realized when I wrote the Peacemaker's Code was that there's still a lot of room left for taking the student's perspective more effectively. Because having now just written something that is very entertaining and very sort of, you don't want to put it down, those elements are not so often there in the classroom or in a lot of the other books that we write. There still is a little bit of an element of, I got to take the vitamins. And that's okay, because I wouldn't, in a classroom, would not want to sacrifice insight and educational value for entertainment value. But one of the concepts we talk a lot about at HBS, at least, and I assume other educators talk about it as well, is that you have to have the right combination of light and heat in the classroom. For a discussion to really stay with people, if you just lecture all the insights, it probably won't stay. If there's discussion, if there's debate, if there was some heat in the room, if there's a little bit more emotion in the room, those same ideas are more likely to last and to stay with people and to remind them. It could be an interesting story that stays with them. So having written something this extreme on the fiction side, entertainment side, with lessons in it, I think when I go to write my nonfiction book, I'm going to be a little bit more gravitating towards, let me make this not just an educational, but a really, if not entertaining, but really enjoyable experience from beginning to end. And I'm going to sort of shed some assumptions I have about what a format of a book should even be, and how long chapters should be, and how much, how deep do you need to go for the average reader to get something out of this before you're just talking about stuff because you think it's on the margins possibly interesting. So I think it shapes my view on how to convey ideas to an audience, because the feedback so far in the book has been very positive, and I want to take the best parts of it and see if I can improve my nonfiction writing as well.
So I'm going to ask you one more question from my reading of the book, and if it forces you to divulge a spoiler, you can simply pass. And then I'm going to turn to some of the Q&A that's coming in online. So as particularly toward the latter part of the book, I found you providing messages not just about negotiation and diplomacy, but also about morality. Do you want to talk about any of your intended moral messages that come out of the book?
Yeah, so I don't know if they're intended moral messages. That's maybe it's the right phrase. It wouldn't have been the phrase I would have sort of gotten to. But I think when you're dealing with the concepts of war and peace and ultimate conflict and no-win situations, and you're dealing with other human beings and other parties that are different from you, I think it inevitably raises questions about what is your sense of morality and what do you think are the ethics you take with you into the room. And I've always been someone who talks a lot about, even in my negotiations course and in the War and Peace course, on elements of empathy and understanding the other side's point of view and the importance of that, especially when things get bad. And one of the things my negotiation students would have probably heard me say is things like, empathy is needed most is needed most in situations where you're dealing with people that seem to deserve it least. That's when it matters. That's when it matters that you understand somebody's interests, their perspectives, their constraints. That's what helps you move forward. So there's elements of that I think become highlighted in really interesting ways in this book. There's aspects of being a little bit more willing to sort of combine patience with perseverance and really sort of not giving up. And even when you're dealing with situations where it feels like there's no way forward, I think the way you bring everybody together in a certain direction that you need to move requires you to be creative and imaginative, all towards doing the greater good. And so getting out of your own head and being a little bit egotistical, all these elements I think are sort of in there. And then there's sort of broader messages, I think, in the book about who we are as people. How did we get to where we are? Why do we look the way we do? Why do we fight the way we do? And I think those are the kinds of, if not messages or lessons, that's the kind of food for thought that I think if I was to teach this book, even in a classroom, would be a really interesting way to think about and debate about what are we doing right and what are we not doing so well as human beings? What makes us so unique? What makes us interesting? What makes us so creative and imaginative and innovative and in some ways progressive, and at the same time mired in conflicts that we can't get rid of even after decades or centuries of trying? Why is it that we still have all this baggage and we continue to fight and kill each other while we have all these other positive attributes? How do we sort of make sense of those things? And to me, there might be some messages in there. There might be sort of a perspective that I'm sharing in there, but also there is just the desire to get the reader or the student to start asking those questions and reflect on it. Because I think when we reflect on those sort of paradoxes, I think some enlightenment does come. And it does make us a little bit better equipped when we run into a difficult situation with people we don't like or don't want to be talking to. It does give us a little bit more sense of, you know what, let me try it differently, or let me try a little bit harder, or let me try to understand. And those elements, I think, can help us move forward.
Great. So there are a number of questions coming in that actually connect to your comment about class, at least partially to classroom, and I'll broaden it to format. So one person asks, are you going to turn this into a case study, or maybe broaden that to, if you were going to use Peacemaker's code in the classroom, how would you use it? But there's other people who just want to know about format, who may not want to read so much. They want to know, does the book exist in audio format? Are you thinking about movie rights?
So I'll try to answer all those as efficiently as I can. So right now it exists in paperback and in sort of ebook format. In the US and in Europe and a few other countries, it's available in both of those formats. In some countries like India and Australia, and I saw some folks in the chat saying that they're in these places, especially the people in Australia. Thank you for staying up if you stayed up just for this, but if you're up partying and you just happen to run into this, that's okay too. The paperbacks aren't available there, but the ebook is. Audiobook will be available everywhere as soon as it's done being produced, which will be in another month or so. So starting in April, there will be an audio format for those of you who like me, often have more time. Well, it used to be when I was driving or at the gym, but now it's at home. But so there will be an audio format. In terms of the classroom, one of the things that I told my students in the War and Peace class on day one was, you're going to do more reading in this class than you've done in any other class, because I don't want to just give you nuggets of history and then sort of quick summaries of things, and then we're going to try to pretend we're having a really intellectual debate when we really don't have all the facts. So my average case was like 3 to 7 times longer than a case we would normally use for a business class discussion. And so if I was going to use this in the course, it's possible that some of the insights that come out of writing this fiction book would make their way into other class discussion. But if I was going to actually use a Peacemaker's code, which I never thought I would use in the class, but when Max read the book, and then 2 of my other colleagues, Kevin Moen and Kathleen McGinn, when the 3 of you read this book, you all seem to think that, hey, this is the kind of thing that would be interesting to discuss in the classroom as well. So if I was going to take that seriously, I would probably assign the book and spend 2 to 3 days on it and related ideas. But I would only do that if I felt like I can't bring those ideas in more efficiently just through classes or other readings, right? So I don't care if any of my students read this book. I want all of them to read it because I think it's an interesting book and it's a fun book. But in the classroom itself, there's only one thing that matters, which is what will help my students the most. And if I come to the conclusion that this deserves a couple of days, a couple of sessions worth of discussion, then it'll be in the class and I'll ask them to read it. And if not, if I think that, you know what's best for the students is to talk about a few other things that are more important and weave some of the best of this in there, then I'll find a new way of doing it. But I haven't quite come to that problem yet. I have some time to figure that out. As far as movie rights, it'll be very, if anybody in the audience is, I don't know if you work at Disney or Netflix or something, shoot me an email or something. But there is one of the most common reactions I've been getting on email from people who have read it is that question, which is, I could see this as a book or as a movie or as a series. And I don't know enough about that world, but I'm definitely open to the idea if somebody credible with interesting ideas of how you turn a book into a movie would do it. Those of you who are waiting for the movie to come out, I wouldn't wait for the movie to come out because most movies just suck relative to the book. So if you're interested in the actual content of the book, read the book or listen to the audiobook and tell me what you think about it.
Well, if the movie comes out, I'm going to see it. And because as I mentioned to you, I read your book as I was watching the Watchmen series, and I think that your storyline is better in a variety of ways. So I look forward to the movie.
Excellent.
So Richard Kakalski asks, and other people want to hear your answer to his question, and that is, with multiple months since you finished the book, have you learned anything that would lead you to change anything if you were to sort of edit the book, which I assume you're not going to do?
It's a great question. I finished writing the first draft of it in early August. And that's when another maybe 12 people started reading the book. So the first 10-ish people had been reading all along. I had ideas from them already. So I'd gotten a lot of feedback. Then another 12 people read it, sort of the more finished product. And they got to read it all in one go. So now I had 22 people from a lot of different sort of walks of life, people that I know though, giving me feedback. And I did. So what I was doing between August and February was exactly what the question is about, which is, would you change something? And so I spent a lot of time until February 3rd, I think is when I was making my final edits. And some of it was, I ripped out one storyline that wasn't going somewhere. I sort of gave much more background on some characters, which was sort of a common ask from some of the early readers, which is like, you know what, the story is great, but I just need to know more about these characters. Like, what's their journey? How do they get to where they are? So I filled those things in. So I haven't learned anything since February 3rd till now that would make me want to revise it. And now it's sort of, the cake is baked, right? So, I mean, it's sort of hard to unbake and rebake it. But that doesn't mean I'm not open to all kinds of reactions, because this is, as far as I know, not the last time I'm going to write or educate or teach. And anything somebody says to me about what they like or dislike, about what I teach or about what I write, is always useful for the next time you sit down with a keyboard or the next time you sit down or stand up in front of an audience. So the more I learn may not change this book, but maybe it changes the future things that I do.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask an adaptation of a question by Nathaniel Chang, because I think we need a little bit of introduction before we get to his question. And within your book, you have excerpts from, and I'm afraid to pronounce it, Heirs of Herodotus.
Heirs of Herodotus, yes.
Yeah, so introduce the audience to those excerpts and what they're doing and what you're trying to convey in that process. So first describe it so that.
Okay, so I'm gonna do this in a way that is least spoilery, not at all spoilery. So one of the things that ends up happening is that as you're reading this sort of adventure, this journey that Professor Kilmer and these other characters are going through in this situation that they're in, one of the things that starts happening is every so often later in the book, you see a snippet, an excerpt from something this Professor Kilmer had written in one of his books. And his book was titled Heirs of Herodotus. And Herodotus refers to the first historian. And he's written a book. This is fictionalized, of course. So in this fictional world, Professor Kilmer is known for this one book he wrote. And the reader of my book every so often gets to see a snippet of what Professor Kilmer had written. And one of the things you start seeing soon is that a lot of those ideas that are embedded in his writings, and those are all real things. Those excerpts are all real history, even though they're made up by me through Kilmer. And we're getting layers. It's like Inception or something. Those elements end up sort of playing off of the actual storyline of the book. So Professor Kilmer is going through this journey with all these other characters, and the book that he's written previously, whose excerpts the reader gets to enjoy along the way, are interwoven with the storyline that he's going through in sort of, I think, interesting ways. That book, Heirs of Herodotus, is Professor Kilmer's nonfiction book. So elements of his nonfiction book that I've just made up are embedded through the book. I don't know if that actually, I think when you read it, it becomes a lot clearer.
Well, what I think Nathaniel actually wants to know is, are you going to write that book?
Yes. So a lot of people are curious about that.
Or are you going to write a book about the problems that you think the Earth needs to solve that you address in the book as well?
I see. So this is someone who's obviously read maybe the whole book. I think that the book that I would write next would be closer to Heirs of Herodotus than it would be to sort of my take on how do we solve sort of the rest of the problems that might be addressed here. What I would love to do in a way that's only hinted at and touched on in the Peacemaker's Code is write something that, whether you're sort of a citizen of the world, whether you're somebody of the, a member of the voting public in any country around the world, whether you're a policymaker, what are the things that we need to understand about how we got where we are and why the conflicts exist that exist, and what are the things that work and don't work? Because I think unless people are a little bit more educated about these things and understand history, we often will end up making the wrong decisions or supporting the wrong people who are making decisions. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about in the War and Peace course that's relevant here, and that's also sort of talked about in the Peacemaker's Code, is that one of the mistakes people make is that they just copy and paste strategies in the past that worked into their new situation. But you should never copy and paste strategies or tactics. What you want to do from your understanding of history and from your understanding of your experience about what's worked and hasn't worked in the past, you want to take out the principles. And it's your understanding of those underlying principles married with your understanding of the situation you are currently in that helps you decide what your strategy or your tactic should be. And so in my class, I would often say, we are not going to extract punchlines from history. We're going to try to understand the principles. So for example, analogies are a way that a lot of policymakers and people make decisions. But how do you know which analogy to use? So if you're thinking about whether to enter Iraq, if your model for what an occupation looks like is what the US did in Germany or Japan post-World War II, if that's your model, if that's the analogy that you think is most relevant, you might say, let's get in there. But if your analogy happens to be Vietnam, you might say, wait a second, let's not do this. So how do you decide which one is the appropriate analogy? How do you understand which of those insights or lessons are the right lessons of history for today? If you study World War I, you might walk out thinking, you know what? One of the lessons of World War I is if you have too itchy of a trigger finger, if you're too wound up, if there's no slack in the system, if you're too quick to be aggressive, wars that could have been avoided end up blowing up. So what people should have done in World War I is they should have worked a little bit harder and made more concessions and not been so quick to fight. Now you take that lesson, and if you blindly start applying it to every future conflict that's escalating, you might make the wrong decision, because people that study World War II will say the problem is exactly the opposite. It's when you're not aggressive enough, it's when you're not being strong enough that conflict escalates out of control. That's why we end up appeasing people like Hitler. So how do you decide which model is correct? Is it that aggressive actions early on deter wars, or do aggressive actions early on lead to wars through escalation? And I think the problem is people walk around with very sort of punchliney versions of this rather than digging deeply to these paradoxes, to these sort of dichotomies, to these things that seem to be pushing in opposite directions. And so the beauty of history isn't just that, you know, it's interesting to some people, or that you may learn something about how people were in the past. It's a guide to what we should do tomorrow if we understand history enough and properly, and we have enough analogies and principles in our mind. But we also know that until we figure out which is most relevant to today's situation, we won't be able to make sense of what to go forward with. And I think that's one of the things that, going back to the question about, well, what book would I write? What I want to try to do in a way that would be hopefully widely read so that it actually can make an impact, but really sort of talk about 5 or 10 or 15 of these kinds of things in an informed way, so that the voter and the policymaker and the concerned citizen of the world knows how to think about the latest news, the latest conflict in their country, in their region, in their neighborhood. How do they think about that without going to the sort of gut instinct reaction, without going to the way they've always thought about it, without being too easily influenced by the person who's telling them, here's why you got to think about it, and to be able to sort of bring some of their own insights and understanding into that discussion, into that understanding.
Great. So Norbert Berger and others want to know, are there other authors who inspired you?
So one of the things that in the dedication line, right, so of this book, the first line, there's a few dedications on it, but was to my parents and to my teachers and to my wife for making this possible. And the sort of the teachers part of this, to me, to me, it's very salient how lucky I am to have had great teachers, and not just in the classroom, but in life, including people whose works I might read. These are all things, these are all people that teach me something. So I've had people like Max in my life, who's been a great mentor. He was there when I first got hired at HBS. Keith Murnian, who was my PhD advisor. Sifu Brown, who is my martial arts instructor, or Sensei Nick, who's my a different martial arts instructor. And then there's people whose work I read. My drama teacher in high school taught me a lot about this stuff. But when it comes to fiction specifically, I never thought of myself as a huge sort of sci-fi buff. But when I reflect back, I guess I've read a decent amount of science fiction. So one way that this book was described, and I can sort of, somebody else used these terms, but they capture 3 books that I've read and enjoyed. It's sort of like Ender's Game meets Da Vinci Code meets Sapiens. So now you think of those 3 books, they're actually very different books. You have Ender's Game, which is sort of a sci-fi book, and I loved the book Ender's Game. If you haven't read it, it's a great fiction book. There's some elements of that. There's the Da Vinci Code, sort of like this fast-paced sort of mystery, what's really going on here. There's a lot of that. And then Sapiens is a nonfiction book by Yuval Harari. I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, but I'm quite sure that's how it is. Sapiens is a great, it's long, a nonfiction book about who are we and how did we get here. But along the way, I've read just scores and scores of books on history and war and peace and diplomacy. I've read a lot of fiction. So I think all of those books influenced me in probably shaping, if implicitly at the time, what I consider good writing and not so good writing, effective writing and less effective writing, enjoyable writing and less enjoyable writing. And I like writing. So I think those lessons for me probably filtered in beyond the names of people I could possibly name.
So there are a couple of questions that take the form of asking you to apply the messages from your book to current problems. So I'll just tell you a couple of them, and I'm sort of adapting from Vijaya Tadapalli and Hu Yan's questions. But the context that they bring up are Brexit, or the Brexit failure, as Vijaya describes it, and Trump negotiating with Fauci. And so can you—
These are both already past negotiations, these most recent ones, yeah. Go ahead.
So, but the question, the questions are basically asking you, are there insights from the Peacemaker's Code to either Brexit or the COVID negotiations?
So if you had picked any 2 conflicts, so what would connect those 2 negotiations or conflicts would probably have been different depending on which 2 things in the universe you picked. But one thing that certainly immediately came to my mind when you said both of these elements, like if you're Fauci negotiating with Trump or you're negotiating Brexit, let's say from the UK side especially, and I think this would extend to a lot of other conflicts that are going on right now. Whether it's what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Myanmar, what's happening in just all these other existing conflicts that have been going on for a long time. These 2 just happen to be things that have more recently been in the news more, but there's many more conflicts. One of the things that I talk about explicitly in the War and Peace course and is more implicit in aspects of the book is the element of moral courage. And I think that, so in the War and Peace course, we talk a lot about if there was a failure of negotiation, and I said earlier, what is your theory of the case? At the highest level, one of the things we did in our course was this failure, let's figure it out, is it due to a failure of negotiation, a failure of strategy, or a failure of leadership? And we would try to use that framework to figure out what exactly went wrong. Did we negotiate poorly? No. The negotiation wasn't the problem. It's our whole strategy was wrong. No, our strategy was right. It was a leadership problem. We had the wrong leadership. And what I've come to realize in these real world big issues, whether it's climate change, Brexit, vaccination related stuff, but any of these things, is that the element that's often to blame in those negotiations isn't that the people aren't smart enough to craft the at the table negotiation approach, although there's a lot of room for improvement, but that's not the death knell. What's often lacking is the moral courage of the leaders involved or the individuals involved. You don't have to be the leader. You could be the subordinate that needs moral courage. And the willingness to take risks and put yourself out there and do the thing, like telling people what they don't want to hear, is an act of moral courage. I think that was completely lacking in the Brexit case, for example. I think that, again, you can be on either side of Brexit, and what your values are and what your views are and whether the UK should be in or outside Europe is certainly your option. But the way it was handled clearly showed a lack of moral leadership. People were not honest about things. In the US, we find the same thing. People are not willing to say what people don't want to hear. And one of the challenges of leadership, in fact, we define leadership in my course as a set of challenges. It's a set of challenges, the most important of which is the challenge of moral leadership. And I think you can have a great strategy, you can have a great approach to negotiation, you can have a negotiation advisor, but if the key stakeholders that you put into office, quite frankly, we can maybe blame ourselves as well a little bit, don't have the moral courage, or we don't give them a way to be more courageous. If we don't reward moral courage, we will end up with decisions that in retrospect will look bad, and we might even place the blame on the wrong thing.
So as an author and as a friend of lots of authors, I commonly see authors spend many, many, many months dealing with agents and publishers and thinking about this whole process. In contrast, kind of this book exists within a fairly small number of months since you started writing it. Professor Dolly Jug, the amazing best-selling author, wants to know, why did you decide to self-publish?
So a couple things. So the trade-offs between self-publishing and publishing through a traditional publisher are at the highest level pretty easy to sort of imagine, right? So if you go through a traditional publisher, they take care of a lot of the work of finding a cover designer and finding an editor and a formatter and dealing with the distribution of it and all these sorts of things. And what you give up in exchange is some control and some money. Now, the hope is that, or the pitch of publishing companies is, understandably, that you're not actually even giving up any money, because we will get more of your books sold than you would be able to do as a self-published author. And I think in a lot of environments that might be true. If you're somebody who's never published before and you get a first book deal through a publisher and that's the way you're going to be known, that might be true. But at least in my experience, unless a publisher is willing to put into the contract that they're going to spend a ton of money on promotion, that they're going to buy bookshelf space, they're going to advertise, not just sort of shoot out, emails and put you in newsletters, but actually put $10, $20, $30, $40,000 behind your book. Unless they're willing to do that, in addition to whatever advance they pay you on royalties, they're probably not going to reach a bigger audience than you would yourself. And I think in most authors that I know, and Max, you can tell me if you feel differently or if your friends feel differently, most authors I know that are, let's say, at business schools or beyond, would say that the promotion piece is not what publishers actually end up doing. You end up having to do a lot of that on your own anyway. So I've never self-published before. And if I had early on gotten one or two of the top 2 or 3 publishers to immediately want to do this book, it would maybe have been a different story. But from around last June, July, I was already talking to a friend of mine who I had met through another friend. So the friend is Hugh Howie, who is a brilliant science fiction writer who also made it big self-publishing and is sort of the icon for people who want to self-publish and to still be able to be successful. I got in touch with Hugh last summer while I was still writing this book, told him about it, started talking about self-publishing, because I thought, you know what, this might be as good a time as any to experiment with that. And all I can say is so far, I'm very happy with how things are going. I've learned a lot. I've been able to put out a paperback, an ebook, and an audiobook will be coming out. I'm open to telling anybody else who's in this audience some of the things I've learned. Maybe one day we do a Zoom event on that. Max and I have already talked about some of these ideas. So to me, it's been a nice journey.
Deepak, thank you so much for sharing your insights about the process and your own personal journey on what you've been going through over the last year or so of your life, and how you've kind of pivoted in terms of your own strategy, in terms of your writing and your teaching. So we appreciate learning more. I certainly encourage everybody in the audience to read the book if you haven't already. Again, you could wait for a different format, but Deepak's recommendation is go with the written form in the very near future. So thank you for being with us. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to Nicole.
Great. Thank you so much. I will just be very quick and say that, thank you to Deepak and to Max and to everyone who attended today. What a fun way to tie in all of those great negotiation lessons that we love in the concept of fiction. I told Deepak I had a great time reading this, and it was so great that this was, considered part of work this week. So thank you for that. And with that, we had a lot of questions about where folks could learn more about negotiation and negotiation concepts. That wasn't really the objective of today's talk, but the good news is that is what the program on negotiation is about. And we have put up some of our upcoming executive education trainings that are available. All are online, different formats, different lengths. And we will soon also be releasing a roster of our fall trainings as well. So we hope that you will take the time to visit our website to learn more about negotiation and the opportunities at PON. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and congratulations, Deepak, on this wonderful achievement. All right, we'll see you soon at our next PON Live event. Thank you.